Tony?
I think that one of the interesting things, especially reading it in a psychological context that you're presenting, is another doubling in the Poe, which is the haunting aspects of it. There's something terrifying about these madmen that bury things and that put it away. But the terror from the stories actually comes from the return of those things.
Yes.
And so there's this doubling terror, the terror of being the person that wants to shove those things away and push them down and hide them. There's a horror and a madness in doing that.
Right.
But there's also a horror and madness in creating circumstances that then allow it to come back.
That's right.
And so there's an interesting commentary there on social restrictions and taboos and repression and things like that. That by repressing it, you create the circumstances for it to come back and haunt you. And the story resonates so profoundly because of, I think, in some ways that double terror.
Right.
Of both sides.
I agree. Yes.
Do you get the sense that this is beyond just being an individual kind of personality, but also like a greater social concept? So you mentioned that with the romantic tendency to see personality as like a vacillation between light and dark, right? That it's not just one person could suddenly become a madman, but that we could all be like a community of madmen.
Yes.
So, do you get that? Does like that comes up in World War II that we're just lots of
Oh, yeah, sure. I think he fits into that concept very well. Well, I don't know. There's not a lot of good people. There are the crazies. Even Dupin is nutso in his way. He's highly eccentric, as Holmes will also be. So much was stolen from Dupin. I would urge you, although the second detective story, all of these detective stories are so frustrating because at least with Holmes, he gets up and does stuff. With almost every single case, the 3 cases that Dupin solves, it's totally armchair, and it's all recounted in retrospect. So he sits in his armchair, he might sneak out at night, and he might do a little bit of investigating, but we're not privy to that because the narrator doesn't observe that happening. So in all of the Dupin stories, everything's told from him sitting in a chair going, well, I've solved the mystery. Write me a check, please. 50,000 francs, let's have it. And then everybody goes, oh, how's that possible? And then he recounts what happens. And so my students read these things and they go, this isn't Holmes. This nothing's really happening. He's sitting in a chair the whole time. He needs to go up and do the fisticuffs like in the more modern Holmes movies. I don't know. People want action.
There's an interesting commentary though there on the author creating the story. Too.
Yes, right.
The author creating a mystery from his armchair.
That's right.
Creating these things, whereas it's not until you certainly have in Poe's generation, but even later where you get the Hemingway-esque writers who are men of action.
That's right.
Or Stephen Crane, who came after Poe. These men who had to get out there and live.
That's right.
And I think that there's an interesting parallel there to those who create the stories and whether they're armchair writers or
Right.
not.
Right.
Well, I think part of the horror too is that whole idea of the doppelganger or Jung's shadow archetype, where there's that side of us that our society and culture forces us to keep hidden. But as in Jekyll and Hyde, what happens if we let that loose?
Right. Right.
And Stephen King called watching horror feeding the alligators, which is kind of a safe way of watching something grotesque and feeding that dark side and not letting it out. And I think part of the horror is when we realize that could be us.
Right.
That dark side.
Right.
That we all seem to have.
And as you would know in your studies of a lot of contemporary horror, so much of it springs from Poe and then makes its way into the popular culture and the Gothicism and the horror of a more contemporary era.
Absolutely.
So
it's the same basic things that scare us. It just
Right.
depends on how they're crafted.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. Did I see another hand up? Yeah. Dr.
This is sort of a biographical question. It's more about his education. I sense when I read him particularly, and this has been one of the great benefits for me of Poe and the Pit, is this annual occasion to read Poe out loud.
Yes.
And the challenge of some of those sentences,
Oh.
the very strange, what for us would be strange syntax. And what I'm wondering is, because there's so much classical reference in him, and it was very common, I know in England, for those of the Romantic era to be steeped in not only classical texts, but classical languages, and translating classical languages, that so many of those writers of that generation, of the Romantics, had to sort of shrug off a lot of that classical training, because it doesn't match well with the tendencies of English, both the syntax and the cadences of the language. And I'm wondering if Poe had a similar education. I don't know what level of formal education, and if it involved what, some version of what they would have had in England,
Right.
classical.
Right. He was well educated. He was an orphan child. His parents were actors, and they died. They both died when he was very young, and he was taken in by a very wealthy family from Richmond called the Allens, hence his middle name that's spelled uniquely. So the Allens, as per the story we find in William Wilson, actually took him abroad. They gave him a fine education in the South. He considered himself a Southerner. He traveled in Europe. He went to some British schools and received some continental traveling and education too. So quite sophisticated in that way. And I think that we see that in his many references. He's frustrating because I teach American lit in a chronological way, and so I try to make the argument that here's all of these European legends and all of these elements of British and continental literature that come to the United States, and these authors make them American. And of course, Poe doesn't do that. You couldn't tell that Poe was an American writer, except for very, very few rare stories. Almost everything is set in the distant past, or in a European setting, or in a setting that we're not familiar with. Some carnivalesque event that's happening in Rome or Italy. We're not quite sure. But he's, of all of the early Romantic writers, he's the least American of them. And maybe that's why the French loved him so much. I don't know. Because of the character assassination he received after his death, he did not do well in the country for a while, but then the French just thought he was brilliant, and then that washed back to the United States, and then he was, eternally canonized in the literary canon, and remains so today. Partially because he's just so darn interesting in some of the things that he does. Some motifs, it would have taken 2 hours, but some motifs I didn't get to. This whole idea of these individuals, these narrators that have such heightened senses in the Telltale Heart, hearing that narrator that kills the old man. He continues to talk about how his hearing was so acute. And of course that lends us to the ending of the story when we start hearing that heartbeat, boom, 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 that comes on, and he's the only one that hears it. Usher is exactly the same. Part of the disease that he has to do with an acuteness of sensitivity. He has to keep the blinds closed at all times. And the only instrument he can play is his guitar, very lightly. And of course, this once again sets us up for the story where Madeline's trying to scrape her way out of the tomb. And he's the only one that can hear it. Because when she crashes into the room, he admits, I've been hearing this for weeks, and I haven't been able to do anything about it. It's been driving him insane. So this sensitivity, and I interpret that as once again the Romantics' reaction to the prior age of empiricism, of the Enlightenment, to the Benjamin Franklin-esque scientific approach to the world. We utilize our senses. We utilize these senses to objectively figure out how the world works through deduction and logic. And then the Romantics say, no, it's not as simple as that. There's more to it. And sometimes you cannot trust your senses. And if that's the case, then all science becomes useless, according to the Romantics. Yeah, shake that fist. The other interesting trope that, once again, this becomes apparent if you start doing word searches of all this electronic Poe text, the eye. Poe is constantly making reference to eyes. Constantly. The bulbous, luminous eyes of Usher, the eyes of the cat that get cut out. Even Dupin has to hide behind these green shaded eyeglasses so that when he's investigating the room of Minister D, he's able to look around without anybody seeing him. So these constant references to eyes that appear in Poe. What that all means, whether it's the window of the soul or some other speculative approach, I don't know.
In the Telltale Heart, isn't that what it initially?
Yeah, it's the old man's eye that sets off the narrator. He
Yeah.
can't stand that eye,
Yeah.
and he'll have none of it. So it's like, okay, whatever. Guy's got a weird eye. And then you get into, and I do not like French psychological theory, especially Jacques Lacan. But he's got a whole entire books on the eye and being caught in the gaze and G-A-Z-E. So once again, the French love him for that very reason. They're able to interpret all of these works through this kind of psychological me-other thing and the connection between people, between the gaze that people have. And it's there. It's hard for me to read. I just never liked it. So there's more tropes out there too. I don't know. Any final thoughts? Any final questions? Yes, sir.
I don't know if this is a question or a statement.
All right.
It comes out. But thinking about this concept of like duality within Poe, you've talked about it in stories. You've talked about it within Poe himself.
Mhm.
Which one is he? Is he
Right.
Poe A or Poe B? But as we talk, then there's also this third complicating factor, this duality of Poe mythology.
Yes.
And we're hitting around this today, and there's even a duality with which Poe is taught at
Right.
various levels.
Right.
For instance, I can't count the number of times that I've heard Poe taught through the lens of this extremely crazy person whose life was so horrible. So many of the women that he loved died, and that is all he knew was misery.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this other side that he's just so damn smart
Yes.
that he is able to use that to his advantage in a time before we want to have the social media to make those things work for him.
Right.
It's kind of amazing.
It is. And it's fun from today to be able to look at those things. Hey, yeah, that's cool too. But you're right, that duality just continues in ever extending concentric circles. Poe. Kind of stuff. Anybody else? Last chance to get in?
It's scary. I'd like to know what happened to Ethan. Oh, my wife can.
You didn't wall him up somewhere? Yeah. Very good. All right, well, thanks, everybody. I appreciate you coming.